Hello, and welcome back to David Starkey Talks. Well, actually, a bit of a bitter welcome, I suppose, as we are at the fag end of this long and deeply depressing general election campaign. I want to begin by focusing on three key moments in that campaign. You'll be familiar with two of them. I hope the other one is a bit more surprising, and the other one, in fact, is the key to what I want to say later. The first moment, well, you're familiar with it, of course. D-Day, poor old Rishi and D-Day, or rather Rishi sloping off from D-Day just at the point that it got international, which, of course, is what D-Day was. Now, I've already commented on this kind of behaviour, which I fear is actually rather typical of the man, and I have, of course, received vigorous censure. So I will rephrase it. It means the same thing, but I'll use different words. I think what it shows is that Rishi just lacks nous. Nous about people, nous about politics, nous, I fear, about the country. For a very brief period of time, he remains Prime Minister. It's, well, again, as I've said before, Rishi is very bright. He's clever. He's good with numbers. He's even a reasonably good debater. He's especially good, I gather, with spreadsheets and the like. In other words, he's what? Well, he's an international businessman who knows to quote yet again, but it's always worth quoting, the price of everything and the value of nothing. That wonderful remark of Oscar Wilde. And that, I'm afraid, is poor Rishi. The next incident, that really, I think, is where centrally, not simply Rishi, but Rishi's government, and I think probably mainly the Conservatives, have gone wrong. Gone wrong, certainly, for the last 14 years, gone wrong, arguably, since Margaret Thatcher, when conservatism becomes simply a kind of dry as dust, free market economics, the worship of free trade, and so on. Once again, politics is about other things, as somebody almost as famous as Oscar Wilde, Jesus Christ, said, "Man does not live by bread alone, or even by twiglets," as I gather is the case, or is it Twix, or whatever it is, with Rishi Sunak. Well, that's the government, anyway, that we had. What about the government we're going to get, or at least the Prime Minister we're going to get? Well, the memorable moment with Starmer, again, absolutely stand out. It's when the TV audience laughs at him, when he bangs on for the umpteenth time, but his father was a tool maker. And that look of cold fury on his face, the contempt. And what does that tell us? Well, the first thing it tells us is that he's hopeless at reading an audience. He's got absolutely no sense of the arts of public speaking, which is very much also, remember, the art of public listening. You can only talk to people if you also listen to them. You gauge their reactions. He was completely hopeless at that. It also shows something else. They were laughing, not ill-naturedly. They were laughing, of course, not at his father, or his father's supposed social class. Though I gather it's a tool. He was a tool maker that became, I think, we gather, a company director who, does that mean he ceased to be this wonderful thing called a working person, or whatever it is that was supposed to kneel and adore along with Black Lives Matter in the world of Sir Keir. So it's his lack of a sense of humour, I think. It's that lack of a sense of proportion, the ability, dare one say it, to laugh at himself. I think, you see, there's something very closely related between a sense of humour, a bit of wit, a bit of lightness, a bit of self-mockery, and that fundamental quality, which actually is intelligence. Because I think, actually, we'll find out, Starmer is very much less intelligent than Sunak. In other words, he lacks conspicuously one of the central qualities of a prime minister. Prime minister, it's an extraordinarily difficult job, which is why, as we've discovered recently, most people are rubbish at it. It is ultra demanding. So we've got a bit of insight into Starmer. Now, all that's so obvious, lots of other people have talked about it. Maybe I brought the little odd detail in. But let me bring what I think is actually the most important element of this general election campaign. Not a politician, it's not a broadcast, it was a decision of the Supreme Court. Decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Finch versus Surrey County Council on the matter of oil drilling. And what it ruled was that Surrey County Council had to take account not simply of the environmental effects of the actual drilling, but also the environmental effects of, believe this or not, the burning of the fuel that might be extracted. This, you see, I think, is a symptom of where we've got to. Big decisions now, big decisions like, can we have oil wells? What is to be the nature of fuel? And remember, energy. Can we just get this absolutely straight? Energy, cheap, plentiful energy is what, along with cheap, plentiful freedom, has made our civilization. We cannot exist without it. Anyway, those decisions are big decisions. They should be taken at the top. They should be taken by people who are responsible for them. That's to say, politicians voted in, and as we're going to find out by you and me, but not, it seems to me, as they have been taken. The Supreme Court's decision effectively outlaws onshore oil drilling. Simple as that, and probably indeed offshore as well. That is a decision which has profound effect. It led, of course, to a division in the Supreme Court itself. There was a dissenting judgment from Lord Sales, which I have to say was infinitely more impressive than the majority decision. And in it, Lord Sales used words like proportionality, incoherence, the proportionality. I mean, how on earth can Surrey County Council take a serious decision about the environmental consequences of, in the sense of the burning of oil, and weighing the deleterious effects of the burning of oil against our need for energy? How is a county council equipped to do that? As he pointed out, this is an offence against proportionality. It's an offence against the Constitution. It puts onto the shoulders of a very, very minor and not terribly well qualified body. Our local government is usually not terribly distinguished anymore, I suppose, than our national government is much of the time, but at least we pretend to regard our national government at a higher level. And what Sales was doing then was reiterating the old view, two views actually, basically that judges shouldn't be dealing with this kind of big question. That's the fundamental constitution as we used to have it. And secondly, that we ought to have a degree of good sense about how we distribute power in our society. There's a distinction between local and national government, and indeed national government in this sense, which is also, of course, involved in international decisions, treaties, and so on. The Constitution. Now, that's a word which we haven't really heard very much about, though towards the end of its manifesto, Labour does make a bit of it. But I think it's a word that should really have been at the heart of this general election campaign, should really have been at the heart of the last 14 years, because we've got a constitution which has been deliberately, not, let me use as moderate language as possible, not destroyed, but deliberately neutered. The English Constitution, again, this is what Lord Sales was talking about, interestingly enough, very much supported in an article in the Times by Lord Sumption again drawing the distinction between the power that properly belongs to the elected representatives and the power that properly belongs to law and lawyers. Now, this division was absolutely intrinsic, central to English government from the Glorious Revolution onwards. The Glorious Revolution did two things. It drew a clear line between the law and politics. That's in the section of the Bill of Rights which specifies that judges cannot interfere in the proceedings of Parliament. Point one. Point two, it established thereby, theoretically and within the next few decades in practice, the supremacy or the sovereignty of what we call Parliament. Not simply the sovereignty of the House of Commons, but the sovereignty of that whole body of King, Lords and Commons. And it's very important to understand what that means. It's not a sovereignty which simply resides in those gilded chambers in the Palace of Westminster, people wearing funny clothes. That sovereignty is the embodiment of something else. It's a sovereignty which comes from the fact that Parliament is representative. It's representative of you and me. And this fact, one way or another, has actually been understood almost as long as the history of Parliament, which is pushing 700, maybe 800 years. As early as the 14th century, you'll get the judges dealing with some obstreperous little person in East Kent or North Yorkshire, wherever it was, saying, we weren't present in Parliament, we don't have to pay the taxes that were voted in Parliament, by saying quite simply, it is the law that everybody in England is represented in Parliament, either in person or by his representative. And what has been decided by all binds all. That extraordinary constitution, which proved its flexibility over hundreds of years in accommodating to astonishingly different circumstances, and also, of course, allowed the incorporation without needing to be destroyed, as continental systems of government were, that was able to accommodate rising social classes. So, for example, the Chartists aren't struggling to destroy Parliament, they're clamouring for representation in Parliament. The suffragettes, again, they aren't just shouting down with it, they're saying we want to belong. And, a typical product of it was Nancy Astor, MP, who was hardly one of the common people. I've gone over all this several times, but it's worth repeating that what happened under New Labour from 1997 was a concerted and deliberate attack on these ideas, on the sovereignty of Parliament, on the representative quality of Parliament, and on the division between Parliament and law. It took three main forms. Power was siphoned off from Parliament in three, and that's to say, can we just get this really clear? Siphoned off from you and me. We had, and I think we need the past tense, a parliamentary democracy. The power of Parliament, the power of the Commons is what it says. It's the power of you and me, the common folk, the working people, except I want to say the common people, all of us, that thing in common. That's why Parliament was sovereign. And that power deliberately under Blair and especially Brown was transferred away. It was transferred first to specialist committees, specialist quangos like the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which sets interest rates, like the Climate Change Committee, which handles matters of, climate change, which is now the most important single area of government policy, rightly or wrongly. Again, English nature, which again isn't just responsible for the birds and the bees, it's responsible for the fact that the birds and the bees, in the form of newts and toads and bats, often take precedence over human beings and human housing and so on. So you create a government that is no longer Westminster, that is no longer Parliament, but instead devolved into a series of specialist quango, allegedly expert one-issue bodies. That was one great change New Labour, building to an extent, it has to be said, on what Margaret Thatcher had done. The second great change on New Labour was the incorporation of ideas of universal or European human rights with the incorporation of the European Convention of Human Rights into English law. Now, human rights sound absolutely lovely and cuddly and wonderful, but of course human rights have been perverted. They have been turned not into the protection of the majority against the state, but the protection of minorities against the majority, which requires, of course, the whole machinery of suppression of the state to keep the rest of us in line. And again, there's another fundamental issue. Human rights claim to draw their authority from some overarching notion outside the state, outside and by definition above Parliament. So the notion of sovereignty, the very notion of national sovereignty, is instantly eroded. And it's not accidental that human rights are used to justify repeated breaches of our frontiers, because the very idea of European, or still worse, the United Nations Declaration, universal human rights, implies there's nothing special about citizenship. There's nothing special about being British. There's nothing special about being an illegal immigrant. We're all humans, aren't we? And again, this utterly fundamental attack on the notion of national sovereignty, on our rights to decide our own laws and their applicability, even to defend our very frontiers. And then the final thing that was done was again, this is a matter of law, and it goes back to the case that I mentioned now, the invention of this thing called the Supreme Court. Now, how can you have a Supreme Court and a sovereign parliament? And as we've just seen, the Supreme Court arrogates to itself the powers of an American Supreme Court. We were promised that it wouldn't, but it does. And it's choosing to determine matters of fundamental national policy, like can we extract fossil fuels or not? Still worse, it broke the very Bill of Rights under Boris Johnson by declaring that the prorogation of Parliament was illegal. This is a manifest breach of the most fundamental aspect of the separation of powers between judicial power and legislative and executive power. It's a matter of profound danger. And again, of course, it leads to the terrible lawfare that we see in America, which again depends on that notion of law being superior over actual political decisions. Political decisions need to be legal and to proceed according to law. But the idea that law stands above, the idea that there's a government of laws rather than men, is preposterous. I want my government to be human. I want my government to be human. It's got a face, a character, and I above all want to be able to throw those people out if they don't do what I want and don't do what I think is right. So all of that was profoundly harmed by New Labour. It should have been reversed by the Conservative governments. Instead, they only intensified it. And we are reaping the terrible consequences. And the consequences are going to be even worse. I bothered to read the Labour Manifesto. It is a wearisome and profoundly depressing exercise, but I have done so. And let me tell you, if you think it's bad at the moment, and why do I think it's so bad? Yes, I've given you reasons in principle. The reason that it's bad is that it effectively renders government impossible. We cannot stop the small boats because of human rights. We barely got Brexit because of the intervention of lawyers. Any form of house building is practically impossible. We've strangled ourselves in regulations and a legal and administrative structure which is virtually impenetrable to political pressure. And you know what? Starmer wants to make it worse. Starmer is completely in the succession of Blair, indeed, much more, let's get this right, the succession of Gordon Brown. And isn't there actually really a rather striking resemblance of character between those two men? That sulky arrogance, that sense of superiority, that pretending to represent common people and actually being fundamentally, intrinsically contemptuous of them. Anyway, if we look at the new manifesto, what is quite clear is that we've been told we're going to have growth, we're going to have this miracle, there's no need for higher taxes, or there is, but only on people who not working people. I'm not quite sure what. Oh, that's right. Do you remember, with that wonderful sense of wit and immediate sense of the reality of the financial situation? I think Starmer said it was the kind of people who, you know, couldn't sign a cheque. Was it for £100? Sense of I haven't seen the cheque for 20 odd years. I doubt, but I imagine, of course, as a very well paid QC, he did, with lots and lots of zeros on them. Anyway, where we've got ourselves to then is a government which is determined, on the one hand, to have growth, which requires freedom, which requires a reduction of the preposterous red tape that we are, and another one that's determined, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, is actually determined to tie the red tape ever tighter in bigger and bigger bundles, and constantly reinforces the power of this entire structure that I've been deciding. So Rachel Reeves, the one who's going to get us going, is going to find herself having literally to be double guessed by yet another one of these bodies, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the migration, which of course Labour, Yvette Cooper, has actually promised to do something about it. Well, that's going effectively now to be handed over. It is already in large measure to yet another committee, the Migratory Advisory Committee. We're going to set up, of course, yet more of these things, an Industrial Strategy Council. We're going to set, in fact, when I went through this, I kept feeling rather sorry for the poor typesetter. He must, in the old days, when you're actually using movable type, he would have begun to run out of capital letters. There are so many new bodies being set up. There are so many, offices of this and offices of that, and Great British this, Great British Energy, Great British Railways, and it's actually worthy of Charles Dickens. There's the admission that we probably do need to reduce the amount of regulation that we have, and to make it a bit more appropriate. So what do? Well, you set up another office, a regulatory innovation office. It is this is now yet another quote. It's Charles Dickens' circumlocution office. It is government that ties itself in knots, legally, administratively, and expertly, as it were. That's the general flavour of this manifesto. It's a manifesto that, what's it doing? Well, it's very difficult to see. I mean, presumably Starmer imagines that he's going to get growth. Therefore, he must actually believe, against every single piece of evidence repeatedly confirmed since the days of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, that the last way you get growth is by regulation and state intervention. But you see, he's a lawyer. He believes in these things. He's a socialist, hard socialist. So he believes that planning, above all, he's a hard socialist, he's a lawyer, and he doesn't believe in freedom. There is no mention in the multitude of words in this manifesto ever of freedom. We are there to be administered, planned for, regulated, controlled, divided racially, divided economically. We are never, ever to be free. So it is profoundly depressing. what's even more depressing was when I began to approach it in a slightly different way. What, generally speaking, of course, the manifesto denounces passionately the last 14 years. Everything is to be blamed on the Conservatives. But then my eye lit on something. It's the beginning, in the middle, and very much towards the end of the manifesto. Listen to this carefully, because what is terrifyingly clear is that Starmer, and I believe it's called Changed Labour, loved the COVID lockdown. Let's just begin. Very first section of the manifesto. This is Starmer speaking in his own voice. The country I see is one where these mysterious working people never let each other down. They came together in the pandemic, he announces. Missed weddings, funerals and last goodbyes to save the lives of the people they will never meet. Elsewhere, we find, well, one of those dreadful wise men of the pandemic. I mean, the three wise men, I think, more properly to be described as the three horsemen of the apocalypse. Sir Patrick Vallance popping up this time to support New Labour on heaven only knows what, but its demented green policies that aim to make us completely green by 2030, which, can I remind you, is in barely 5 years' time. Anyway, Patrick Vallance is a deuce. And then finally, the one good thing about COVID, the extraordinary achievement of the vaccine, is likewise praised, but is completely misunderstood. Here is the claim. The COVID-19 pandemic showed how a strong mission-driven industrial strategy involving government partnering with industry and associated with industry and academia could turn the tide on the pandemic. This is the approach we will take in government. This is the approach we will take in government. Well, indeed, the discovery of the vaccines was very remarkable. But if you remember, it was nothing to do with an industrial strategy. It was the complete opposite. It wasn't government taking over industry. It was a brilliant entrepreneur in that field, Kate Bingham, taking over government and knocking heads together. Exactly, for example, as happened in both world wars under Churchill and Lloyd George, when clever businessmen were brought in to do things which rigid civil servants and generals wouldn't do. So the one good bit about COVID is misunderstood. In fact, deliberately stood on its head. But it's this thing that worries me. This sense of, wasn't COVID wonderful? Because I think this is the clue to what life will be like under changed Labour and Sir Keir Starmer. It will be like a prolonged COVID lockdown. We will all be gathered, beating saucepans, worshipping the NHS. We will have stupid policemen arresting people for, walking hand in hand or sitting on a park bench or using mildly inappropriate language at some point. We will have a world in which, well, that world, what? Let's get them right. The snitchers, the snoopers, the mask wearers, and the curtain twitchers are given free rein. That's going to be, I'm afraid, the world of Sir Keir Starmer, Prime Minister. And let's now just start to fit Starmer's character into this world. I've already mentioned his spectacular lack of humour, his dullness, his Gordon Brown, big heavy fisteries, pride in authoritarianism. I'm ruthless, he says. What does it remind you of? Well, I think again I need to substantiate a bit my remark about saying that I didn't think he was very bright. I deduced it from the fact that he didn't have a sense of humour. But there is actually, in the multitude of increasingly fawning profiles of this man, there was one absolute nugget of information. Can I gently remind you, Sir Keir Starmer went to a fee-paying school, what became a fee-paying school, Reigate Grammar School, a highly selective school, as a scholarship boy. Now, normally you are the pick of the bunch. You are expected at an academic school to perform seriously well. And yet, how did this shining light of law perform? He got 2 B's and a C in maths, physics, and music. 2 B's and a C. That is shockingly mediocre for a scholarship boy in a selective school. I, another son of a toolmaker and another grammar school boy, know that. So what is the key to Starmer? How did he get on? Clearly, we have the report of a contemporary at school, Andrew Sullivan, that he was always intensely ambitious. How does somebody, with a very indifferent A-levels, going to an indifferent university, going to Leeds, how does he actually get where he did? He gets there because he's a slogger, because he works hard and he's determined and he's got that sense of purpose. He's a kind of, but I know he's supposed to be good at football, at least interested in football. Essentially, he's that awful slogging thing called a cross-country runner. There's a character in Anthony Poole's Dance to the Music of Time called Widmer Poole. Starmer is another Widmer Poole. Or perhaps I can give him a better name. Perhaps we can really characterise him. One of the things that Starmer is very keen to tell us is, of course, that he was the public prosecutor, except he always refers to himself as the chief prosecutor. Sounds a bit like chief executioner, doesn't it? He was the chief prosecutor. He bangs on about his role in policing, the number of people that he sent to jail, and so on and so on and so on. You know what? Let's put these two ideas together. He's a plodder. He got there by plodding. He's also, isn't he, the ultimate tiresome policeman. Sir Keir Plodder. Sir Keir Plod. Just imagine him with a constable's helmet on his head and, rather than Casey after his name, PC, the typical stupid modern policeman with that faint swagger, that superciliousness, that eagerness to put down the ordinary citizen for no very good reason at all. And it's not, just dear Sir Keir. It's also the woman that he's chosen as his chief of staff, Sue Gray. Now, Sue Gray was an important civil servant. Fine, don't we need people with serious grasp of policy? But you know what? Sue Gray wasn't in charge of policy. Sue Gray was something completely different. Oh, and by the way, she has a very, let's just leave the curious episode in her career out for the moment. Sue Gray was something else. She was centrally in the Cabinet Office, and that's the very, very heart of government, and she had a very particular role there. She invented the role. She was the head, the director of propriety and ethics. This is this notion that there is some kind of abstract code that governs everybody in government, and she was the enforcer. In other words, she was the policeman woman. She was the law. And we have the testimony to the effectiveness of her power from somebody who had to live with it for a long period of time, Oliver Letwin, who was the Cabinet Office Minister in the days of the Coalition. Nothing he said in Whitehall happened in Sue Gray, or rather, nothing in Whitehall happened without Sue Gray knowing about it, or indeed effectively agreeing to it. She was the boss. This kind of policewoman figure. because also, of course, the propriety and ethics, and I don't want to go into this in detail, but I will just drop the hint now, runs what is really the English Stasi. It keeps records on us. It takes secret delations, secret accusations. It does not communicate the name of the accuser to you. It holds mock quasi-trials, administrative procedures in private. It only tells you the result once a verdict has essentially been reached, and you've then got to argue against a decision already taken. That's the work of Sue Gray. And by the way, she did have a little period out of Whitehall when she mysteriously goes off to run a pub in the troubled Badlands between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland on the border. And there's a very powerful suspicion that she was a police spy. So we have a government run by a plodder and a policewoman. Oh dear. Oh dear. But where does that put all this in a broader historical context? You see, again, there's a remarkable quality, not, I think, particularly about Sue Gray. And Sue Gray, I think, probably shared the alcoholic inclinations of the Northern Irish, and certainly on one of the famous COVID parties, which she later investigated, she did actually supply the karaoke equipment, though I think she wasn't actually present. But Starmer himself, although he apparently likes the occasional beer, there is that quality, isn't there, of a Puritan. There is that, again, it goes with this kind of general policeman quality about the man. The quality of a Puritan. And I think that what we're going to see, to summarize it very quickly, we are going to see a regime very similar to that of the Puritan Revolution of the 17th century. A regime with a man, clearly infinitely less talented than Oliver Cromwell, but with Cromwell's sense of a driving mission of control, a belief that he has a right to control, a belief that we, the people, need control. And finally, of course, a belief fundamentally that we really shouldn't enjoy ourselves. The overwhelming sense of changed Labour is one of a kind of, how shall one put this? Well, a kind of NHS handout, or one of those tiresome sets of instructions you get from your doctor about how much you're supposed to drink, how much sugar you're supposed to have, whether you should have chocolate or not. That is the sense of the world. And of course, what can one hope? One can only hope that that Puritan revolution, which of course finally might actually be made permanent. If you look at the very end of the Change Labour Manifesto, there's a reference to a scheme for the improvement, of course, the reform of the House of Lords to get rid of the hereditaries, who are some of the few interesting people left in it, as opposed to the collection of stale ex-MP placemen, get rid of the hereditaries and get rid of every peer over the age of 80. Somebody coming knocking up to that point, I feel deeply annoyed about the fact. But there's then this odd phrase which says, "But of course, we're actually committed to doing something much more serious about this, and we have a program." And let me see if I can find the exact reference here. Here we are. We are committed to replacing the House of Lords with an alternative second chamber that is more representative of the regions and nations. Labour will consult on these proposals. This is a reference to a commission, once again, chaired by Gordon Brown, that would, if it were put fully into effect after those consultations, would complete what I described as the evacuation of power from Parliament and away from you and me. because what it would do effectively is to make Parliament cease to be sovereign. The House of Lords would indeed become representatives of the nations and the regions, but it would be given special powers to block any legislation passed by the Commons that was deemed to contradict a new constitution, new written constitution, that would incorporate new human rights. And these human rights, for example, would include the right to free healthcare. In other words, you would legislate the NHS into the Constitution. Again, it would include the absolute right to welfare for anybody legally in the British Isles. In other words, the moment an immigrant steps on shore, whether he's illegal or not, he is liable, he is required to have full welfare. Now, that would in fact conclude the process which began in 1997. It would turn the entire machinery of government into an obstacle for anything but a Labour government. The only government that could actually work happily with this structure of the courts, of the quangos, and of human rights is a Starmer-like government. It is an attempt at actually making this permanent. It's of course a determination that Brexit would never happen again, that there would never be a referendum, and above all, to make it nearly impossible for there to be an effective Conservative government. That means that the task, because I fear it is the task of opposition, and it may well be a very long opposition, the task of opposition is to recover that determination to change, real change, that determination that empowered and inspired Margaret Thatcher exactly 50 years ago and inspired her through that remarkable figure, Keith Joseph, who in 1975, after yet another long period of failed Tory government and the defeat of Edward Heath by Harold Wilson, and Starmer, get this right, Keith Joseph realised that although he'd called himself a Conservative and been a member of a Conservative government, they hadn't been Conservative. And he then realised that the first thing that a Conservative government had to do, as Margaret Thatcher understood too, was to repeal, in her case, to repeal the laws favourable to trade unions, which empowered them, the laws nationalising industry. An incoming Conservative government, and there will be one, I am absolutely convinced of this, an incoming Conservative government will have to have a similar confidence, but it will have to be a similar confidence based on similar deep research and understanding of the need to repeal in its entirety the legislation of New Labour and Change Labour. Take our constitution back to what it used to be. Take our constitution back to the supremacy of Parliament, which means the sovereignty of Parliament, which means the sovereignty of you and me, of the people. That is what we need to do. It is, interestingly enough, what happened exactly in 1660 after the fall of the Cromwell regime. We called it a restoration. I want another restoration.